Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager. Tonight, we are going underground. Literally. We're talking about Derinkuyu, an ancient underground city carved into the volcanic rock of Cappadocia, Turkey, stretching somewhere around 80 metres straight down into the earth, with room for roughly 20,000 people, their animals, their wine, their olive presses, and their collective decision to never go outside again. And honestly, relatable. But before we descend, if you're enjoying what we do here, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually want to. No pressure, no guilt, no passive-aggressive reminder at the end of every paragraph. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is, because somehow it is always 2 a.m. and someone is always eating toast in the dark. I see you. I respect you. Now let's pause for a moment because I need you to really think about this. Have you ever looked at your apartment, your house, your aggressively beige studio with the one window that faces a wall and thought, you know what this needs? To be 50 feet underground and accessible only through a tunnel that one adult can barely crawl through. Did the ancient people of Cappadocia wake up one morning, look at the perfectly reasonable surface of the earth and collectively decide, nope, too visible, too breezy, too exposed to the concept of sunlight? What kind of threat makes 20,000 people say, forget fresh air, forget the sun, forget being able to stand upright in our hallways, we're going down? Did they have a homeowners association meeting about this? Was there someone who voted against it? And if so, where is that person's skeleton? And did it end up in one of the tunnels? Would you have been the person who dug, the person who organised, the person who looked at a small hole in the ground and thought, yes, I will raise my children here? Could you live for months, possibly years, in a space lit by olive oil lamps surrounded by the smell of livestock and fermented grape and collective human anxiety, with a massive rolling stone as your front door? Congratulations, you have just woken up in Cappadocia. The year is somewhere around the 7th or 8th century. The sky's enormous and the threat is real, and someone has just told you it is time to go underground. Again. You don't have Instagram to distract you. You don't have a therapist on retainer, and your commute to the livestock pen is technically downhill. Welcome to Derinkuyu. Mind your head. Let's start with the most obvious question. The one that has been sitting in the back of your brain since the moment you heard that 20,000 people willingly moved into a hole. Not a cave, mind you. Not a cosy, naturally formed grotto, where a stream trickles and moss grows on the ceiling, and it all feels vaguely romantic in the way that only geology can be. No, this was a deliberately, painstakingly, back-breakingly carved underground city, dug by human hands through solid volcanic rock over what must have been generations of labour, presumably accompanied by an enormous amount of sighing. The people of Cappadocia did not stumble into Derinkuyu the way you stumble into a good parking spot. They built it, they planned it, they committed to it with the kind of energy most of us only reserve for assembling furniture from flat-pack boxes and then immediately regretting every choice we've ever made. And the thing is, it wasn't small. We're not talking about a basement. We're not talking about a charming Hobbit-adjacent situation with a round door and some nice exposed beams. Derinkuyu goes down approximately 80 metres into the earth. That is roughly the height of a 26-storey building, but inverted, descending below your feet into the dark. It has estimated space for around 20,000 people. It has streets, or at least tunnel corridors wide enough to function as streets. It has kitchens, stables, wine cellars, storage rooms, churches, schools and wells. It is by any reasonable definition a city. It just happens to be a city that looked at the sky and said, no thank you, not today, possibly not for several months. Now, here is the part where modern life offers a genuinely useful comparison. Think about the last time you worked from home for an extended period. Think about week 3. Think about the moment when you realised you had not been outside in 4 days. that the distinction between Tuesday and Saturday had become philosophical rather than practical, and that you were starting to have opinions about the ceiling. That was voluntary. That was with electricity and delivery food, and the knowledge that you could leave whenever you wanted. The people of Derinkuyu went underground with their animals, their children, their elderly relatives, their grain stores, their anxieties, and their collectively held awareness that the reason they were down there was very much still happening on the surface above them, and they made it work for centuries. The question of why anyone would choose this only makes sense if you assume the alternative was acceptable. It wasn't. The surface in Cappadocia during the periods when Derinkuyu was most actively used was a place where armies passed through with the regularity and destructive enthusiasm of weather systems. The plateau sat at a crossroads of ancient empires: Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Mongol, and each of these powers at various points in history sent forces across it for reasons that had nothing to do with the welfare of the people who happened to live there. When you live at a crossroads, you learn very quickly that most of what passes through is not stopping to be friendly. So the choice was not really between living underground and living comfortably above ground. The choice was between living underground and living above ground in a way that ended badly, repeatedly, with limited warning. Faced with those options, 20,000 people looked at the volcanic rock beneath their feet and thought, that will do. That is survivable. That is home. And they were right. Which is, when you think about it, either deeply inspiring or the most exhausting thing you have ever heard, possibly both. Before we can talk about the people who lived inside the rock, we need to talk about the rock itself, because Cappadocia's geology is genuinely one of the stranger things the planet has ever produced. And the planet has been at this for 4.5 billion years, with a lot of unsettling results. The region sits on a vast plateau in central Anatolia, and millions of years ago, back when the Earth was still figuring out what kind of mood it was in, a series of ancient volcanic eruptions blanketed the landscape in thick layers of ash and lava. Over time, this material compressed and hardened into a soft, porous stone called tuff, which sounds like something a toddler made up, but is in fact the reason an entire civilization was able to carve an underground metropolis with relatively basic tools. Tuff is hard enough to hold its shape, soft enough to carve with iron and determination, and porous enough that it breathes, which, as it turns out, matters enormously when you're planning to cram 20,000 people and their goats into it for an indefinite period. The volcanic history of Cappadocia is not a single event, but a long episodic process. The two primary volcanoes responsible for the region's distinctive landscape, Mount Erciyes and Mount Hassan, were active over an enormous span of geological time, and each eruption added new layers of material to the growing plateau. Think of it as a geological lasagna, if the lasagna was made by something with absolutely no interest in your comfort and a very long time horizon. The ash layers compressed at different rates and with different mineral compositions, which is why tuff is not uniform throughout the region. Some of it is softer, some harder, some more prone to erosion than others, and the people who lived here over thousands of years learned to read these differences the way a carpenter learns to read wood grain. You carved where the carving was good. You left alone what resisted. The porousness of tuff is the underappreciated hero of this entire story. Stone that breathes, and tuff does, in a genuine physical sense, allowing air and moisture to pass slowly through its structure, maintains a relatively stable interior climate. The temperature inside Derinkuyu stays at roughly 7 to 8 degrees Celsius year-round. In winter, when the Cappadocian plateau is cold enough to be genuinely unpleasant, that is warmer than the surface. In summer, when the plateau bakes under the Anatolian sun, that is significantly cooler than above ground. The rock was, in effect, a natural climate control system, running continuously and silently, requiring no fuel and no maintenance. It is the ancient world's version of an air conditioning unit, except it also happened to be structurally sound enough to build a city inside. None of this was luck exactly. The people who expanded and developed Derinkuyu over centuries understood, through accumulated experience and observation rather than geological science, But understanding is understanding regardless of the vocabulary it uses, that this particular rock, in this particular place, had properties that made underground living not just possible but surprisingly tolerable. The geology did not create the city, but it made the city conceivable. Without tuff, without the specific volcanic history of this specific plateau, Derinkuyu is a desperate idea that collapses under its own ambition somewhere around the third level. With tuff, it becomes an 80-metre masterpiece that survives thousands of years and still has functional ventilation. If you have ever seen a photograph of Cappadocia, and if you have not, you are genuinely missing out on one of the most visually unhinged landscapes on Earth. You will know that the surface of the region looks less like a real place, and more like the background of a children's book, written by someone with a very specific fever. The fairy chimneys, as they're called, are tall cone-shaped rock formations that rise from the earth in clusters, some of them topped with darker stone caps that make them look like enormous mushrooms wearing hats, or like the earth grew teeth and then felt embarrassed about it. These formations were carved by millions of years of erosion, wind and water slowly eating away at the softer stone around the harder volcanic cores, until only the columns remained, standing there in the landscape like geological oddities that couldn't quite decide whether they wanted to be art or geography. And directly beneath all of this visual chaos, the people of Cappadocia were quietly digging. The fairy chimneys are not just decorative, they are functional in ways their creators, which is to say, millions of years of weather, did not intend but which the human inhabitants of Cappadocia were quick to appreciate. Early residents carved homes directly into the chimneys themselves, hollowing out the interiors to create dwellings that were cool in summer, warm in winter, and invisible from a distance unless someone was specifically looking for doors. From a raiding party moving through the valley below, a cluster of fairy chimneys looked like a cluster of fairy chimneys. It looked like geology. It did not look like a neighbourhood. This was extremely useful, and not by accident. The people who chose to live inside rock formations rather than build visible structures on the surface had made a deliberate calculation about the value of being uninteresting to look at from a distance. The landscape above and the city below are connected in ways that go beyond the physical. Both are products of the same volcanic history, the same layered tuff, the same slow work of erosion and time. The chimneys above are what happens when the softer material is taken away by natural forces. The city below is what happens when the softer material is taken away by human hands with a purpose. In a certain light, Derinkuyu and the fairy chimneys are the same geological story told twice, once by wind and water, once by people with iron tools and excellent reasons. The surface says, this rock shapes itself into strange and beautiful things under pressure. The underground says, yes, and so do the people who live near it. Walking through Cappadocia today, with its hot air balloons drifting over the chimneys at dawn, in a scene so photogenic it looks computer-generated, it is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind simultaneously both the visual poetry of the surface and the practical darkness of what lies beneath it. But that duality is the whole point. This is a landscape that has always been two things at once, beautiful and strategic, open and hidden, surface and depth. The people who lived here understood both registers. They appreciated the view. They also knew which direction was down and how quickly they could get there. Here is where history does what history loves to do, which is become extremely vague at the exact moment you want it to be specific. The honest answer to the question of who first carved Derinkuyu is, we are not entirely sure, and the scholars who have spent their career studying this question would like you to know that the situation is, quote, complicated. The earliest evidence of underground habitation in Cappadocia stretches back possibly as far as the Bronze Age, which puts us somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, and possibly even earlier, though the further back we go the more we are working with fragments of pottery, and the kind of archaeological inference that requires both expertise and a tolerance for ambiguity. What we do know is that the city was not built in one dramatic burst of communal effort, all hands on deck, everyone chipping away in organised shifts while a foreman with a clipboard checked off rooms. Derinkuyu grew over centuries, possibly millennia, with different cultures adding layers, expanding tunnels, deepening shafts, and essentially inheriting an underground infrastructure that they then modified to suit their own considerable anxieties. The tools used in the early phases of construction were almost certainly stone and bone instruments. The Iron Age had not yet arrived to offer its improvements, which means the earlier sections of the complex were carved by people working with technology that most of us today associate with the word primitive, and which we use to mean slow and difficult. This is technically accurate and also entirely misses the point. Slow and difficult, applied with consistency and purpose over enough generations, produces results that are neither slow nor small. The cathedral builders of medieval Europe understood this. The pyramid builders of ancient Egypt understood this, and the first diggers of Derinkuyu understood this, assuming they thought about it at all and were not simply focused on the immediate problem of making a room where a room needed to be. The transition from basic shelter to organised city happened gradually and without announcement. There was no single moment when someone said, "Right, we are building a city now. We will need 18 levels and a ventilation system and standardised tunnel widths." The city grew the way most cities grow, organically, in response to need, with each generation inheriting the work of the previous one and extending it according to the threats and resources of their particular moment. A room was added here, a tunnel pushed deeper there, a new level carved because the ones above were full and the threat had not passed. What this means, practically, is that Derinkuyu is a document written by many hands in many eras, and reading it requires the kind of patience that archaeology demands and that modern life does not particularly reward. The different sections of the complex show different carving techniques, different levels of finish, different spatial logics that reflect different periods and possibly different cultural practices. It is less like a single building designed by a single architect, and more like a city that accumulated itself over time, with each layer telling a slightly different story about who was there and what they were afraid of. Which, if you think about it, is exactly what cities do. They just usually do it above ground, where the evidence is harder to preserve and easier to knock down. If you are the kind of person who enjoys feeling mildly humbled by the scale of human history, and if you are listening to this channel, the evidence suggests you might be, then the layered history of Derinkuyu's ownership is going to do something genuinely destabilizing to your sense of time. The Hittites, who were one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, and who had opinions about everything from iron working to treaty diplomacy, inhabited Cappadocia from roughly the 17th to the 12th century before the Common Era. And there is evidence suggesting they made use of underground spaces during this period, though whether they were expanding what already existed or starting fresh is a question that continues to produce animated disagreement at archaeology conferences. After the Hittites came the Phrygians, a people whose cultural contributions included a style of cap that would eventually name itself after them and be worn ironically by revolutionaries centuries later, and who almost certainly contributed to the development of the underground complexes during the early first millennium before the Common Era. Then came the Persians, who controlled the region as part of their vast Achaemenid Empire from roughly the 6th century before the Common Era. Then Alexander the Great swept through, as Alexander the Great swept through everywhere, with his usual combination of military brilliance and complete indifference to the preferences of the people he was sweeping past. Then the Hellenistic kingdoms, then Rome, then Byzantium. Each new power that controlled the surface of Cappadocia found, beneath it, the existing underground infrastructure and either used it, expanded it, or simply noted its existence and moved on to the next administrative problem. The tunnels outlasted every political arrangement that claimed authority over them. They have a better track record of institutional continuity than most governments in history, which is either reassuring or slightly pointed depending on how you feel about governments. The Phrygians deserve particular mention here because the evidence of their contribution to the underground complexes is among the more concrete we have from the early period. The Phrygians were not a minor culture. They were the people whose legendary King Midas supposedly turned things to gold with his touch. which tells you something about their relationship to wealth and the stories they generated, and they were skilled craftspeople and builders whose influence on Anatolian culture persisted long after their political power faded. Their carving in the Cappadocian underground shows a level of planning and spatial sophistication that goes beyond emergency shelter. They were thinking about the underground as a designed environment, not just a hole in the ground where you waited until the bad thing passed. What this long queue of cultures tells us is something important about the nature of Derinkuyu as a piece of infrastructure. Good infrastructure outlasts the people who build it. Roads built by Romans are still being used in Europe. Aqueducts constructed in the ancient world still carry water in some regions. And an underground city carved by Bronze Age inhabitants of Cappadocia was still being used, expanded and relied upon by Byzantine Christians 1,000 years later, and then by various communities after that, because it was well built, well located, and addressed a need that did not go away when the builders did. The specific threats changed. The specific people changed. The specific gods worshipped in the underground churches changed. But the fundamental human calculation, it is safer down here than up there for now, and down here is livable if we are careful about it, remained constant across every culture that descended into the rock. Before we go down, and we are going down, we are committing to the descent, we are following the tunnel all the way, it is worth spending a moment on the surface, because Cappadocia above ground was not a wasteland or a void, or a place so inhospitable that underground living was an obvious improvement. The plateau sits at roughly 1,000 metres above sea level, which means the air is cool and clear, and the skies are the kind of enormous that can make you feel both very small and somehow at peace with that. The land was fertile enough to support agriculture, wheat and barley growing in the valleys between the rock formations, vineyards producing grapes that would become the wine stored in those underground cellars. Communities of farmers, herders, traders and craftspeople lived ordinary surface lives in ordinary surface towns, raising children in buildings made of the same tough stone that was being carved below them. In short, the surface was livable, which makes the decision to go underground not a matter of preference, but a matter of something much more pressing. The specific, recurring, exhausting experience of being threatened. The surface towns of Cappadocia were real places with real social structures, markets, religious buildings, and all the ordinary infrastructure of community life. People knew their neighbours. They had regular rhythms, the agricultural calendar, the liturgical calendar for those in the Christian period, the social calendar of a community, small enough that everyone's business was more or less everyone's business. Harvest happened in autumn. Animals were grazed in summer on the higher pastures. Winter brought relative quiet and the particular indoor texture of a community closing in on itself for warmth. This was not a life of constant dread. It was a life punctuated by dread, which is meaningfully different, and which describes the actual experience of living in a contested region better than most historical narratives managed to convey. The relationship between the surface town and the underground city was something like the relationship between a house and a storm cellar, except the storm cellar was 80 metres deep, could house your entire community plus their livestock, and had taken several generations to build. The underground city required maintenance. Someone had to check the ventilation shafts. Someone had to rotate the stored grain so it did not spoil. Someone had to keep the wells clear. This maintenance happened during the normal surface periods, the times of relative security when people were living above ground and the underground city was sitting empty and waiting. It was tended the way you tend something important that you hope you will not need but are quite certain you will, like a first aid kit that the whole town keeps stocked together, except the first aid kit is the size of a skyscraper and goes in the other direction. When the threat came, and it came regularly enough that the decision to go underground was never a dramatic rupture from ordinary life, but rather a practiced, almost procedural response. The community descended in an organised way. Livestock were moved first, down the wider tunnels, into the carved stables below. Grain and oil and water supplies were confirmed, the entrances were checked. the rolling stone doors were positioned, and then the surface town with its ordinary houses and its market and its church was left behind on top of a community that had simply gone somewhere else for a while. From above, on certain days, you would not have known anyone was home. Let us talk about the doors, specifically the single most satisfying invention in the entire history of defensive architecture. A thing so elegantly terrifying in its simplicity that the first time most people encounter it in photographs they say some version of, well, obviously, why didn't everyone do this? And the answer, frustratingly, is that not everyone had both the volcanic tuff and the existential motivation. The entrance tunnels to Derinkuyu could be sealed from the inside using massive circular stone wheels, sometimes called millstone doors, that were carved from the same rock as the tunnels themselves. These wheels could be anywhere from 0.5 metre to over 1 metre in thickness and weighed hundreds of kilograms, the larger ones approaching the weight of a small car, which is a comparison that would have meant nothing to the people who carved them but feels viscerally useful now. The genius of the design was not just the weight, it was the geometry. The wheels fit precisely into grooves cut into the tunnel walls, and they could be rolled into place by a relatively small number of people from the inside. Think about what this means in practice. You are on the inside, you roll the stone into position. The tunnel is sealed. Anyone on the outside, confronted with a circular stone surface that is flush with the tunnel wall and has no purchase, no handle, no lever point, and a combined weight that rules out brute force unless you have brought an extraordinary quantity of both brute and force, that person is not getting in. Not today. Not without equipment that nobody in the ancient world was carrying on a standard raiding expedition. The door was not a lock that could be picked, or a bar that could be broken, or a wooden gate that could be burned. It was a wheel of stone that from the outside was essentially indistinguishable from the wall. You had to know it was a door to look for it, and if you were on the inside, that problem belonged to someone else entirely. There is a detail here that tends to produce a particular kind of quiet appreciation in people who are told it. The rolling stone doors could be closed from the inside, but they could also be opened from the inside, using a small hole bored through the stone near the centre. This hole was precisely the right size to insert a long lever, a pole, a beam, that could be used to roll the stone back into its resting position when the threat had passed and the community wanted to go back to the surface. The hole was too small for a weapon, too small for a hand, just large enough for a tool used by someone who knew what they were doing. The people on the outside, even if they found the hole, could not use it meaningfully without that specific knowledge and that specific tool. Security through obscurity, combined with security through physics. It is objectively a better front door than most modern apartments have. The rolling stone doors were positioned at intervals throughout the complex, not just at the main entrances. Individual tunnels could be sealed off from each other, creating a system of compartmentalized defense where a breach at one level did not mean a breach of the whole city. If an enemy somehow got past the outer door, they would find another door, and another, each one requiring the same impossible combination of strength, knowledge, and the right tools. It was defense in depth, literally, a principle that modern military planners still discuss in strategy documents, implemented here in volcanic tuff by people who understood, from long experience, that the line between survival and catastrophe was often a very heavy circle of stone. If someone told you they were redesigning their home and their plans involved 18 floors, you would have questions. Reasonable questions. Structural questions. Questions about natural light and resale value and whether the homeowners association was going to weigh in. The people of Derinkuyu, who had none of these concerns and all of the volcanic tuff they could ever want, went ahead and did it anyway. Though it is worth clarifying that the 18 floors figure refers to the number of levels discovered so far, and archaeologists are not entirely confident they have found all of them, which is either impressive or slightly ominous depending on your relationship with the concept of depth. The city was not built according to a single master plan handed down from on high, or rather, from on below, but grew organically over centuries, each new level pushing further into the earth, each new tunnel connecting spaces that serve specific, practical, carefully considered purposes. Sleeping quarters, food storage, wine cellars, stables for animals, kitchens with ventilation shafts designed to carry smoke away from the living spaces. The upper levels of Derinkuyu are the most accessible and the most varied in their function. The first few levels below the surface contain the spaces associated with daily life. The kitchens, the communal areas, the stables positioned near the entrance tunnel so that the animals, whose smell and noise and general opinions about being underground were presumably not improved by going deeper, could be managed closer to the surface. The ventilation shafts on the upper levels are wider, the space is slightly more generous, the ceiling heights in some rooms reaching a point where a person of average height can stand without the particular posture adjustment that the lower levels require. This is not comfort exactly. You are still in a carved rock chamber lit by an oil lamp, but it is the closest thing to comfortable that the complex offers. As you go deeper, the spaces change character. The lower levels have a more austere, more purely functional quality, as though the people who carved them had moved past the question of livability and arrived at the question of survival in its purest form. Storage rooms cut deep into the rock, where the temperature was coldest and most stable, designed for long-term preservation of grain and oil and wine. Cisterns carved to hold water, spaces that show evidence of use as sleeping areas, not comfortable sleeping areas in any sense that modern experience would recognize, but spaces where people lay down on stone surfaces and closed their eyes and waited for whatever was happening above them to resolve itself. The spatial logic of Derinkuyu is not accidental. The placement of functions at different depths reflects a careful understanding of security, climate, and logistics. Things you needed often were kept near the surface. Things you needed to preserve for the long term went deep, where the temperature was stable and the threat of discovery was lowest. Things that produced smoke, cooking fires, lamps in large numbers, were positioned near ventilation access. Animals, who produced both heat and significant quantities of agricultural byproduct, were kept in areas with drainage channels carved into the floors. Each decision encoded in stone is evidence of the practical intelligence of people who had thought hard about a specific problem and arrived at a specific solution. The 18 levels are not excess. They are the accumulated answer to the question of how you house 20,000 people underground without it becoming a catastrophe. Here is something that should make you feel both impressed and a little embarrassed about your own problem-solving abilities. The people who built Derinkuyu across whatever centuries and cultures contributed to its construction understood that if you were going to put 20,000 people and a significant quantity of livestock into an enclosed underground space, the air situation was going to require some attention. This was not a naive oversight. They discovered the hard way on day 3 when everyone had a headache. The ventilation system at Derinkuyu is, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. There are over 50 ventilation shafts identified in the complex, some of them plunging more than 50 meters straight down from the surface to the lower levels, carrying fresh air deep into the earth through a network of channels that distributed it throughout the tunnels and chambers. The shafts were narrow enough to be defensible. You cannot comfortably send a soldier down a shaft the width of a dinner plate, but wide enough to keep the air circulating in the living spaces below. The engineering challenge here is not trivial. A single ventilation shaft connecting the surface to the lower levels would create an airflow, yes, but it would create a chaotic airflow, pulling in different directions depending on wind conditions at the surface, potentially flooding lower levels with cold air in winter, or failing to move air at all in still conditions. The system at Derinkuyu was not a single shaft, but a network, designed with an understanding of how air moves through enclosed spaces that is, frankly, more sophisticated than what you might expect from people working with iron tools and no fluid dynamics textbooks. Multiple shafts at different points in the complex created multiple points of air exchange. The cross-ventilation this produced kept conditions in the lower levels from becoming the airless, damp, carbon dioxide-heavy environment that would otherwise make extended habitation impossible. The positioning of cooking areas near ventilation access was not coincidental. Smoke rises, and the people who designed Derinkuyu understood that smoke rising in an enclosed space that does not have somewhere to go will, over time, make that space uninhabitable. The kitchen areas of the complex are positioned in relation to the ventilation shafts in a way that suggests deliberate planning. The smoke had a path, a direction, a way out, and the people using the kitchens were not slowly asphyxiating themselves by cooking dinner, which is the kind of baseline requirement that sounds obvious but required genuine engineering to achieve underground at this scale. There is a detail about the ventilation shafts that tends to catch people off guard. Many of them also served as wells, or were positioned near wells, in a system that combined water access and air circulation in the same vertical infrastructure. This compression of functions doing two things with one carved channel reflects the kind of thinking that arises when every metre of carved rock costs labour, and every additional shaft creates a potential security vulnerability on the surface. You do not cut more holes in your defensive roof than you absolutely need. So when you need to cut a hole anyway, for water, for air, you design it to serve both purposes if at all possible. The ventilation system of Derinkuyu is not just impressive, it is the kind of impressive that comes from a deep familiarity with constraints, and from working within those constraints with more creativity than they technically warranted. You can go a surprising amount of time without sunlight. The human body is adaptable, the spirit is resilient, and the olive oil lamp industry of ancient Cappadocia was apparently doing quite well. What you cannot negotiate with, what will end any long-term underground habitation plan regardless of how well designed the ventilation shafts are, is water. The people of Derinkuyu understood this with the clarity that comes from living in a place where the consequences of not understanding it are extremely final. The city's water supply was built around a series of wells that were dug down through the rock to reach underground aquifers, natural reservoirs of groundwater sitting beneath the tuff layer, independent of the surface and inaccessible to an enemy who might think to poison the water supply from above. This was not an accident of geology that the inhabitants stumbled upon gratefully. The placement of wells, their depth, their integration into the city's layout, this was deliberate engineering, the kind that reflects long experience with siege conditions and a detailed understanding of what happens when a water supply is compromised. The wells of Derinkuyu are positioned throughout the complex at intervals that reflect both the logistical needs of the population and the security requirements of siege conditions. Access to water had to be distributed. You could not have every person in a 20,000-person underground city queuing at one well, not just for practical flow reasons, but because a single point of water access is a single point of failure. If that well was somehow compromised by collapse, by contamination, by a structural problem with the surrounding rock, the entire city's water supply was gone. Distributed wells meant distributed risk. It also meant that even if upper levels were somehow breached and became unusable, the lower levels retained independent access to water and could continue to function. The depth of the wells also served a security function that was not incidental. Enemy forces besieging a surface town could, and frequently did, attempt to contaminate or divert water sources as part of their strategy. A river could be dammed upstream, a surface well could be poisoned, a spring could be blocked. None of these tactics worked on wells that drew from aquifers 50 metres below the surface, in a rock formation that an enemy force had no practical way to access. The underground water supply was invulnerable, in a way that no surface water source could be, and this invulnerability was almost certainly a factor in the decision to go as deep as the construction did. The deeper you go, the safer your water. The safer your water, the longer you can stay. There is something almost meditative about the wells of Derinkuyu when you encounter them in photographs or in person. Cylindrical channels descending into blackness, the sound of water somewhere far below, the stone lip worn smooth by the hands of people who are not here anymore. They are, in a literal sense, the most important things in the complex, more important than the ventilation shafts. though those matter enormously. More important than the rolling stone doors, though those are more dramatic. Without the wells, Derinkuyu is a sealed tomb. With them, it is a city. The people who dug them knew this. They dug them first before anything else. You find the water, then you build around the water. Everything else is architecture. The water is life. Let's think for a moment about who these people actually were. Not as an abstraction, not as ancient inhabitants or early Cappadocian communities, or any of the comfortable academic phrases that keep human beings at a pleasant historical distance, but as people. People who had names and disagreements, and children who needed to be fed, and elders who needed to be carried down tunnels that were, by any modern measurement, not designed for a relaxed stroll. People who had opinions about where to sleep and who got the spot closest to the ventilation shaft and whether the family in the next chamber over was being unreasonably loud at night given the circumstances. The underground city was not a hotel. It was not a bunker in the modern military sense, staffed by rotation and stocked by a logistics chain. It was a place where entire communities, families, extended clans, neighbours, people who probably did not always get along on the surface either, descended together and lived in proximity that would strain the most generous modern interpretations of personal space. Consider what it actually meant to share an underground city with 20,000 people, your animals, and no viable exit strategy for an indeterminate period. Modern humans who have access to separate rooms, soundproofed walls, individual headphones, and the option of leaving still managed to find cohabitation genuinely challenging after about 3 weeks of unusual proximity. The people of Derinkuyu were managing it in carved stone chambers with oil lamps in the dark, with the sounds and smells of livestock 2 levels below, and an unknown situation unfolding on the surface above. There was no going for a walk to clear your head. There was no stepping outside for a moment. Outside was precisely the problem. You were down here specifically because outside was unavailable. The social structures that governed underground life were almost certainly the same ones that governed surface life, brought down into the rock and applied under compressed conditions. The community had leaders, elders, religious figures, people whose authority derived from whatever combination of birth, experience, and demonstrated competence produced leadership in their particular culture. Decisions had to be made about resource allocation, about who got which sleeping space, about the management of the animals, about the maintenance of the ventilation shafts and wells. These decisions did not make themselves. Someone was in charge of something, and the fact that the complex functioned as effectively as the archaeological evidence suggests, it did implies that the social organisation brought underground was reasonably coherent under pressure. What the evidence also implies, and this is the part that tends to get less attention than the engineering, is that the people of Derinkuyu maintained the ordinary texture of community life as much as circumstances permitted. They cooked together, they ate together, they practiced their religion in the carved churches below the surface, they taught their children. They argued about things that seemed important to them, and probably seemed small from a distance of 1,000 years. They told stories. In a dark underground space lit by oil lamps with nothing but time and each other, and the awareness that the surface was currently occupied by something they could not control. The telling of stories was not entertainment in the modern leisure sense. It was the activity by which a community reminded itself that it existed, that it had a past, that it was going somewhere. That is what communities do in the dark. They talk. They remember. They hold each other together with language and habit and the particular warmth of people who have decided, without saying it explicitly, that they are going to get through this together. At some point during the planning of Derinkuyu, and there must have been planning, because this level of construction does not happen by accident, someone said, and the animals come too. And everyone apparently agreed, because the evidence is there in the carved stables built into the lower levels, the stone rings embedded in the walls where animals could be tethered, the channels cut into the floors for drainage, which tells you everything you need to know about what life in the stables smelled like, and nothing you particularly want to visualize before sleep. The animals in question were primarily livestock: horses, donkeys, goats, sheep, cattle, the creatures whose labour and produce and, ultimately, whose bodies were essential to the survival of any agricultural community in the ancient world. You did not leave the animals on the surface when you went underground, not because you were sentimental, but because without them you were significantly closer to starvation than you wanted to be, and because an enemy who found your livestock on an undefended surface was an enemy who had just acquired your food supply and your transport in one convenient package. The logistics of moving livestock underground are not straightforward, and the tunnels of Derinkuyu reflect this. The main access tunnels are wider than would be strictly necessary for humans alone, wide enough for a donkey, wide enough for a cow moving with some encouragement, and presumably a great deal of personal objection. Animals do not naturally want to go underground. This is not a character flaw. It is a reasonable response to an environment that is dark, narrow, acoustically strange, and smells like 20,000 anxious humans who have recently made a collective decision to go somewhere the animals did not vote for. Getting a cow down a tough tunnel by lamplight, while a raiding force is somewhere in the vicinity, is a task that required both patience and a working knowledge of how cows think, which is primarily no. Once underground, the animals occupied a specific zone of the complex, the stables carved into the lower levels, positioned in relation to the ventilation system, in a way that managed their considerable contribution to the air quality situation. The drainage channels carved into the stable floors are a detail that reveals something important. This was not improvised. Someone, before the first animal was ever brought into the complex, thought about what was going to happen on the floor of the stable and designed a solution for it. The channels slope. They lead somewhere. The waste moves away from the living areas rather than accumulating under the feet of the livestock or seeping through the rock toward the water supply. This is plumbing, essentially. Underground livestock plumbing carved in volcanic tuff, probably 2,000 years before anyone would have used the word plumbing to describe it. The animals also provided something beyond food and labour that is easy to overlook: heat. A stable full of large mammals is a significant source of thermal energy, and in the cooler lower levels of Derinkuyu, particularly in winter, the body heat of livestock was a meaningful supplement to whatever warmth the oil lamps and the compressed presence of 20,000 humans provided. This was not an accident of cohabitation. It was, in all likelihood, a feature. The positioning of stables in relation to living areas reflects an understanding that the animals were contributing to the thermal environment of the spaces around them. They were not just mouths to feed and bodies to protect. They were, among other things, extremely large and expensive heating units with opinions about their working conditions. Let us talk about the food, because this is genuinely one of the most impressive organisational challenges in the entire history of human habitation, and it does not get nearly enough credit. Feeding 20,000 people, plus their animals, plus whatever margin you build in for the uncertainty of how long you might be down there, requires a level of pre-planning that would give a modern logistics manager a stress headache, even with spreadsheets and supply chain software, and the option of calling someone for help. The people of Derinkuyu had carved storage rooms into the rock at multiple levels, cool and dark chambers where grain could be kept, where the fermentation of wine and possibly beer could proceed, where olive oil, the caloric foundation of ancient Mediterranean life, and the fuel for every lamp that kept the darkness at bay, could be stockpiled in large ceramic vessels. The storage rooms were not placed randomly. They were distributed throughout the complex in a way that suggests deliberate thinking about access, about the flow of people through the tunnels, about what happens when the level nearest the surface is compromised and you need to reach the supplies below. The food stored in Derinkuyu was not the food of abundance, it was the food of survival, dense, calorie-rich, shelf-stable, selected specifically for its ability to last in a cool, dark environment without spoiling too quickly. Grain was the foundation, wheat and barley that could be ground into flour and baked into flatbread over the underground kitchen fires, dried legumes, preserved olives and olive oil, dried fruit, salted or dried meat, though the logistics of meat preservation underground were complicated enough that fresh livestock were almost certainly more valuable alive, providing milk and pulling capacity, than they were as protein until the situation became sufficiently extended and grim. Wine, fermented in underground vessels, provided both calories and the particular psychological benefit of being wine, which should not be underestimated as a factor in maintaining community morale during an indefinite underground confinement. The kitchens of Derinkuyu are positioned near ventilation access, as we have discussed, and they show evidence of the kind of use that sustained thousands of people over extended periods: smoke-darkened stone ceilings, carved surfaces worn smooth by repeated contact, the spatial arrangement of a place that was used seriously and often. Cooking underground at scale is not a domestic activity, it is an industrial one. Bread for 20,000 people does not happen in individual family units making their own individual flatbreads in their individual chambers. It happens in organised production in shared spaces, with some system of distribution that gets food from the kitchen to the people who need it, in a way that is equitable enough to prevent the kind of conflict that arises when people who are already under considerable stress discover that the allocation system is not working in their favour. The question of how long the stored food could last is one that the inhabitants of Derinkuyu answered, implicitly, by how much they stored. The storage capacity of the complex is substantial. The rooms are large and there are many of them, distributed across multiple levels so that the loss of one area did not mean the loss of everything. Estimates suggest that a fully stocked Derinkuyu could support its population for several months, possibly longer if rationing was implemented and the livestock were managed carefully. Several months is a long time to be underground. It is also, historically, roughly how long a serious raiding season lasted before the raiders moved on to somewhere else. The storage capacity was not an accident. It was calculated specifically for the duration of the threat. Someone had done the math. Here is a detail that stops people in their tracks every time. Carved into the rock of Derinkuyu, deep in the complex there are churches. Full churches, not gestures toward churches, not small alcoves with a cross scratched into the wall and a vaguely hopeful atmosphere, but properly cross-shaped, architecturally considered spatially intentional spaces of worship, with barrel-vaulted ceilings and carved decorative details and the spatial logic of a building designed for communal gathering and liturgical purpose. This tells us something important. The people who sheltered in Derinkuyu during the Christian period, roughly from the early centuries of the Common Era through the Byzantine period and beyond, were not simply surviving in a functional sense. They were maintaining the structures of their communal life. Religion was not a surface-only practice that got suspended when the threat drove everyone underground. It descended with them as essential to the community's coherence as the food storage and the ventilation shafts. The cross-shaped layout of the underground churches is not decorative, it is liturgically specific. The cruciform plan, with a nave and transepts forming the shape of the cross, was the dominant architectural form for Christian worship in the Byzantine tradition, and reproducing it underground in carved tuff required both skill and intention. Someone measured, someone planned the proportions, someone made decisions about ceiling height, and the orientation of the apse and the placement of the altar in relation to the nave. These were not casual decisions made by someone with a chisel and an afternoon free. They were the decisions of a community that took its worship seriously enough to reproduce its architectural requirements precisely, even when those requirements had to be achieved 50 metres below the surface of the earth. Think about what it meant to attend a church service underground during this period. The space is lit by oil lamps, warm, flickering light that catches the curved surfaces of the barrel vault above and creates the kind of atmospheric chiaroscuro that cathedral architects of the medieval period spent enormous effort and expense trying to replicate with stained glass and candle placement. The congregation is gathered in a space that is intimate by necessity. The underground church at Derinkuyu is not large by surface standards. Pressed close together, the air warm from the combined body heat of worshippers and the lamps, the sound of the liturgy filling the carved chamber, and returning from the stone walls with a quality of resonance that flat-roofed surface buildings did not produce. In purely sensory terms, underground worship in Derinkuyu was not impoverished. It was different, and in some respects the intimacy, the acoustic quality, the quality of the light, it may have been more intense than the surface equivalent. The presence of the churches in Derinkuyu also tells us something about the timeline of the complex's development. The cross-shaped churches are associated with the Byzantine Christian period, which means the complex was still being actively developed, still being adapted and expanded to meet the needs of its current inhabitants, well into the first millennium of the Common Era. The Bronze Age diggers who made the earliest tunnels did not carve those churches. They were added by later communities who inherited the infrastructure, recognised its value, and made it their own by carving into it the things that mattered most to them. The churches are, in that sense, a kind of signature, evidence that the people who used this space in the Byzantine period were not merely sheltering in someone else's structure, but had made it theirs in the most permanent way they knew how, by carving their faith into the walls, connected to the churches and deserving its own moment of quiet appreciation, is the evidence of missionary schools within the complex, spaces that appear to have functioned as places of religious instruction, where the faith was taught, where knowledge was passed on, where the community's intellectual and spiritual life continued beneath the rock as it had above it. The early Christian communities of Cappadocia existed in a world where their religion was, for significant periods of history, either illegal, actively persecuted, or at the very least in tension with the dominant political power. The underground city was not just a refuge from armies and raiders. For these communities, it was a space where the faith itself could survive, where teaching could continue, where community could be maintained, where the next generation could be formed in the traditions of their parents, even when the surface world was hostile to everything those traditions represented. The idea of a school underground might initially seem like an extreme response to difficult circumstances, the kind of thing that prompts a modern reader to think surely there were other options, but the historical context makes it less surprising than it appears. The early Christian period in Anatolia was one of sustained and sometimes violent religious persecution. The Diocletianic persecution in the early 4th century, the various waves of pressure from non-Christian imperial authorities before Constantine's conversion, the later tensions between different branches of the faith. All of these created conditions where the ability to practice and transmit the religion depended on having secure, private, defensible spaces. Underground spaces, specifically. Cappadocia, it turns out, had both the geology and the community of believers to make this combination work. What was taught in the underground schools of Derinkuyu was almost certainly scripture, the memorization and interpretation of biblical texts that was the foundation of Christian education in this period, along with the liturgical practices that structured communal worship. In a world before mass printing, before widely distributed written texts, before the assumption that individual literacy was either achievable or necessary for participation in religious life, knowledge transmission was primarily oral and communal. A teacher spoke, students listened, repeated, memorized. The knowledge lived in people rather than in objects, which made it, in a certain sense, more portable and more resilient than knowledge stored in books or scrolls that could be seized, burned, or lost. You could take a teacher underground. You could not as easily take a library. The image of a teacher and students gathered in a carved stone chamber 50 metres below the Cappadocian plateau, oil lamps pushing back the dark, reciting scripture while Nami moved across the surface above them. This image is either deeply moving or deeply strange, depending on your temperament, and possibly both depending on the time of night. What it is, unambiguously, is evidence of a community that understood education as survival. Not metaphorical survival, not the survival of culture in the abstract sense that gets invoked in speeches about the importance of the humanities, but literal survival, the continuation of a living tradition that would die if the knowledge died, and that the knowledge would die if no one was willing to go underground to keep teaching it. They were willing. They went underground. They kept teaching. The tradition survived. It is genuinely difficult to think of a more committed approach to education, and it makes the average modern reluctance to attend a Tuesday evening class look rather small by comparison. The people of Derinkuyu did not build and maintain and expand an 80-metre deep underground city because they were bored and had very sharp tools and nothing else to do with their Saturday afternoons. They built it because the surface was, at various points across a very long stretch of history, genuinely dangerous in a way that concentrated the mind and motivated the labour. The list of threats that drove communities into the tunnels of Cappadocia reads like a survey course in ancient and medieval geopolitics. The armies of the Achaemenid Persian Empire moving through the region during the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, the disruptions of the Hellenistic period, the campaigns of the Arab forces that swept across Anatolia beginning in the 7th century of the Common Era, the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, and various other waves of conflict and instability that rolled across this particular stretch of the ancient world, with a frequency that suggests the plateau was located at an extremely inconvenient geopolitical crossroads. Cappadocia's geography was its misfortune in a certain sense. The plateau sits at a natural junction between east and west, a corridor that armies moving in either direction found both unavoidable and convenient. When the Persian Empire was expanding westward, it moved through Cappadocia. When Alexander the Great was moving eastward, he moved through Cappadocia. When the Arab Caliphate was pushing into Anatolia in the 7th century, the frontier ran directly through Cappadocia. When the Mongols swept westward in the 13th century, Cappadocia was in the path. The plateau did not ask for any of this. It simply sat there, at the junction, being geographically useful to everyone except the people who lived on it. The nature of the threats changed over the centuries, which is reflected in how the complex was used and expanded. The early threats, the pre-Christian period raids and military campaigns, prompted the basic shelter function. Go underground, close the doors, wait. The later threats, particularly the sustained Arab raids of the 7th through 10th centuries, created conditions of such regular danger and such extended duration that the underground city needed to function not just as a hiding place, but as a genuine habitation. This is when the deeper levels were likely developed most intensively, when the churches and schools were carved, when the storage capacity was expanded to support months rather than days of underground living. The architecture of Derinkuyu is, in a literal sense, a record of threat escalation. The deeper you go, the more serious the danger had become. The psychological dimension of living under recurring, unpredictable threat is something that the archaeology cannot measure directly, but that shapes everything the archaeology reveals. A community that has descended into the rock 3 times in a generation does not think about the underground city the way a community that has never needed it does. It becomes part of the mental landscape, a fact of life, a known quantity, a thing you maintain and prepare with the same matter-of-fact regularity that people in earthquake zones maintain emergency kits, or people in floodplains know where the high ground is. The threat was not imaginary. The descent was not panic. It was, over generations, practice. A practiced, organised, community-wide response to a danger that was real and recurring and survivable, provided you had carved deep enough and stored enough grain and made sure the ventilation shafts were clear. Which they had. Of all the threats that the people of Cappadocia faced over the long centuries of Derinkuyu's use, the Arab raids of the 7th through 10th centuries of the Common Era are the ones most closely associated with the intensive development and expansion of the underground cities into the deep, elaborate complexes we know today. Beginning in the mid-7th century, the armies and raiding parties of the expanding Arab Caliphate began moving through Anatolia with a regularity and ferocity that fundamentally changed the security calculus for every community in the region. The Byzantine Empire, which nominally controlled Cappadocia during this period, was fighting a grinding, centuries-long frontier war that it could not always win at the local level, meaning that individual villages and towns often found themselves in the path of a raiding force with no imperial army nearby to intercept it, and no option except to fight, flee, or disappear into the rock beneath their feet. The Arab raids were not random events. They were, for much of this period, systematic annual campaigns launched from bases in Syria and eastern Anatolia, moving through Byzantine-controlled territory with the explicit goals of capturing population, livestock and portable wealth, and weakening the Byzantine frontier. For the communities of Cappadocia, this meant a predictable season of danger that arrived roughly every year with the reliability of bad weather. You prepared. The raids came. You went underground. The raids passed. You came back up. And then, the following year, you did it again. This cycle, repeated across generations, explains why the underground cities grew so sophisticated. Each cycle produced improvements, refinements, additions. The community that descended 10 times had a better underground city than the community that descended once, because they had had 10 opportunities to identify what was not working and fix it before the next season. The scale of the raids varied considerably. Some years brought small raiding parties, fast-moving groups more interested in livestock and opportunistic plunder than in sustained siege operations. Other years brought organised military forces capable of extended campaigns and deliberate efforts to root out populations from their shelters. It was the latter category that drove the deep expansion of Derinkuyu. A rolling stone door is effective against a raiding party that does not know it is there and does not have time for sustained effort. It is somewhat less decisive against an organised military force with weeks to spend and the motivation to try various approaches. The response to this more serious threat was to go deeper, to push the habitable levels further into the rock, past the point where surface-based siege operations could reach them, into an underground environment that even a determined and well-equipped force had no practical way to penetrate. The irony of this period is that the very intensity of the threat that drove the deepest expansion of Derinkuyu was also the condition that produced some of the most sophisticated community life the complex ever saw. The underground churches, the missionary schools, the organised storage systems, the distributed wells. These are not the features of a community in pure survival mode. They are the features of a community that had decided, under conditions of sustained and recurring danger, to live. Not just to survive, but to maintain the things that made survival meaningful: faith, education, community, the continuation of the practices and relationships that defined who they were. The Arab raids drove them deeper. What they did with that depth was their own. If you have been impressed by Derinkuyu so far, and the evidence suggests you should be, then prepare to have your sense of scale quietly recalibrated. Because Derinkuyu was not the only underground city in Cappadocia. It was not even unique. There are estimated to be somewhere between 200 and 600 underground complexes scattered throughout the region, of varying sizes and depths and levels of elaboration, connected to the surface world and to each other in ways that suggest a broader strategic vision of underground living that went well beyond a single community carving a single shelter. The most striking illustration of this is the underground tunnel that connected Derinkuyu to a neighbouring underground city called Cappadocia, located roughly 9 kilometres to the north. 9 kilometres of underground tunnel, carved through rock, navigable in darkness, connecting two communities beneath the surface of the earth in a way that allowed movement between them without ever having to go above ground at all. 9 kilometres underground. Let that settle for a moment. If you have ever walked 9 kilometres above ground, which is about 2 hours at a reasonable pace on a flat surface with good shoes and a podcast, you have some sense of the distance. Now imagine covering that distance in a tunnel carved through volcanic rock, in the dark, with an oil lamp, possibly with animals, possibly with children who are not enthusiastic about any aspect of this situation. The tunnel connecting Derinkuyu and Cappadocia is not large. It is navigable, but it is not comfortable by any modern standard of the word. It is a passage designed for movement under extreme conditions. a supply route, an escape route, a communication channel between two communities who understood that their survival was interconnected and that the distance between them was a problem worth solving permanently. The existence of this tunnel raises a question that is more interesting the longer you think about it. Who organised this? Two communities, 9 kilometres apart, carved a connecting tunnel of that length through volcanic rock. This required coordination across communities, agreement about where the tunnel would go and how wide it would be, and who would do which section, sustained labour over an extended period without the benefit of modern surveying equipment or the kind of precision engineering tools that would make the alignment of two independently dug tunnels meeting somewhere in the middle even theoretically straightforward. And yet they did it. The tunnel exists. The two ends met. By some combination of experience, technique, and the particular human capacity for solving hard problems, when the alternative is worse, the diggers of Derinkuyu and Cappadocia found each other in the dark. Cappadocia itself is the larger of the two cities, or at least the one whose accessible sections cover more area at its upper levels. It shares the same basic organisational logic as Derinkuyu: multiple levels, stables near the top, storage and living quarters distributed through the complex, ventilation shafts, wells, but with its own specific adaptations that reflect the particular character of its location and the communities that used it. The two cities are related but not identical, like two buildings designed according to the same general principles by people who had their own specific requirements and constraints. Together, connected by their underground highway, they represent something larger than either could alone: a network. A region-wide strategy of underground survival, planned and maintained across communities, that turned the landscape of Cappadocia into something with two faces, a surface that looked like farms and villages and ordinary life, and a depth that was something else entirely. Here is something your brain will not immediately volunteer for you, but which becomes significant the moment you consider it. Derinkuyu, at its full depth, received no natural light whatsoever, not a glimmer, not a crack of dawn filtering down a shaft. The lower levels of the complex existed in a darkness so complete that the human eye, given all the time in the world, would never adapt to it, because there was nothing to adapt to, nothing to see, no photons making any kind of effort whatsoever. Every moment of illumination in those tunnels and chambers was artificial, produced by oil lamps burning the olive oil that was stored in the same complex, or by torches of resin and fibre that consume themselves slowly in the ventilated air. The implications of this are not just practical, though the practical implications are considerable, including the constant management of fuel supply and the pervasive smell of burning fat and smoke, but psychological in ways that we do not discuss enough when we talk about life underground. The human relationship with darkness is complicated and very old. We are not a species that evolved in the dark. Our eyes are designed for the kind of light that comes from the sun, and our brains have fairly strong opinions about what it means when that light goes away. Darkness signals danger. In the deep evolutionary sense, it is when predators move, when the things you cannot see have the advantage over you. Managing that ancient anxiety was part of the daily work of life in Derinkuyu, as constant and as necessary as managing the food supply or the ventilation system. The oil lamps were not just a practical solution to the darkness, they were a psychological one. A lit lamp is a claim on the space around it. It says, "We are here, we're awake, we are managing our environment." It's a small flag of human presence planted in the middle of the dark. The fuel consumption of 20,000 people's worth of oil lamps running continuously through an extended underground habitation period is a number that, when you try to calculate it, becomes quite alarming quite quickly. Olive oil was the primary fuel source, and the storage rooms of Derinkuyu contained substantial quantities of it, both because it was a caloric staple and because it was the medium through which darkness was managed. This dual-use quality of olive oil was not incidental to its importance in ancient Mediterranean culture. It fed you. It lit your way. It had sacred significance in religious practice, and it preserved things. It was, in practical terms, one of the most valuable substances a community could stockpile, which is why the storage rooms that held it were among the most carefully positioned in the complex. The darkness also shaped the social rhythms of underground life in ways that differ significantly from surface experience. On the surface, the day is organised by the movement of the sun. You wake with the light, work through the day, rest at dusk, sleep at night. Underground, there is no sun to follow. There is only the lamp burning with equal indifference at any hour. The community's sense of time would have been maintained through shared practices, the rhythm of communal meals, the structure of religious observance, the regular maintenance tasks that needed to happen at intervals. Time underground was social rather than solar. It was kept by people rather than by the sky. And when the lamp was finally extinguished for the night, and the dark was absolute and total, the sound of 20,000 people breathing in the rock beneath the Cappadocian plateau was in all likelihood the strangest and most human sound the earth has ever held. Let's talk about the children, because someone has to, and because the experience of childhood in an underground city during a period of extended siege or threat is one of those historical realities that tends to get abstracted away in the larger narrative of geopolitics and architectural achievement. Children were born in Derinkuyu. We know this because communities do not pause their biology for the duration of an emergency, and because the spaces of the complex include areas that would have functioned as living quarters for families, chambers with carved sleeping platforms, spaces near the ventilation shafts, rooms positioned away from the noise and traffic of the main tunnels. A child born underground during a period of extended habitation might spend their earliest years in a world lit entirely by oil lamp, in spaces where the ceiling was stone and the floor was stone and the walls were stone, and the sounds of the surface, wind, rain, bird song, the particular quality of open-air silence, were either absent or arrived muffled and strange down the ventilation shafts. Think about what it means to grow up with Derinkuyu as your frame of reference for the world. Modern children grow up with an understanding of space that is, almost by default, outdoor and expansive. The sky overhead, the horizon somewhere, distances that the eye can follow without interruption. A child who spends their earliest years in the carved chambers of an underground city develops a different spatial intuition. Ceilings are close, walls are present, distances are short, measured in tunnel lengths rather than open ground. Light comes from a specific, managed source, rather than from everywhere at once. This is not necessarily a diminished experience of the world. Children adapt to and find meaning in whatever world they are given, but it is a profoundly different one, and the adults those children became would have carried the sensory memory of Derinkuyu with them, in a way that shaped how they understood space, safety, and the relationship between the two. Children in Derinkuyu would have been put to work as soon as they were capable of useful contribution, which in the ancient world was considerably earlier than modern sensibility is comfortable with. Small children could carry water, tend to smaller animals, assist in food preparation, maintain the lamps. Older children would have taken on more substantial roles, helping with the livestock, participating in the maintenance of the complex, learning the skills that the community's survival depended on. The underground city was not a place where children were separated from the working life of the community and protected in a dedicated child space. They were part of the community's labour in the same way they were part of its faith, its meals, its social structure. Their smallness, in a context of low ceilings and narrow tunnels, may have been a practical advantage rather than merely a vulnerability. And yet, for all the practicality and the adaptation and the genuine resilience that children in difficult circumstances consistently demonstrate, there must have been moments, a child sitting near the mouth of a ventilation shaft where a thin current of outside air moved downward, carrying with it the smell of the surface, the smell of open ground and growing things and weather, when the distance between the world below and the world above was felt most acutely. Not as deprivation necessarily, not as suffering in the way that adult analysis might label it, but as a kind of reaching towards something that was present but inaccessible, in the way that children have always reached toward the things that are just beyond them, without being able to say precisely what it is they want. There is a question that almost no one asks when they first learn about Derinkuyu, because the mind is occupied with the engineering and the scale and the rolling stone doors and the general atmosphere of ancient competence, and then suddenly, usually late at night, the question arrives: what happened when someone died underground? This is not a morbid detour. It is a genuine logistical and cultural question with real implications for how the community managed its underground life. And the answer tells us something important about the nature of extended underground habitation, as opposed to a brief emergency shelter situation. In short-term refuge scenarios, a raid lasting a few days, a threat that passed in a week. The dead could be carried to the surface for burial when it was safe, but extended periods of underground living, potentially lasting months or longer, created situations where this was not always immediately possible. The burial practices of the communities who used Derinkuyu were primarily surface practices, graves dug in the earth above, in the cemeteries associated with the surface towns, with the rituals and markers appropriate to each culture's relationship with death. For Christian communities of the Byzantine period, proper burial mattered enormously. It was not merely a practical matter of disposing of a body, it was a theological one, connected to beliefs about resurrection and the afterlife and the proper treatment of a person's remains as a sacred object. The inability to bury someone according to the correct rites, in the correct place, at the correct time, created a genuine spiritual and communal difficulty that the community would have taken seriously. The archaeological evidence suggests that in some cases, the dead were held in designated areas of the complex during periods when surface burial was impossible, stored in the cool, stable environment of the lower levels until the threat above had passed and the community could emerge to perform the proper rites. This is a practice that requires a particular quality of practical acceptance, the ability to hold grief and the requirements of survival simultaneously, without allowing either to overwhelm the other. The dead were family. They were neighbours. They were people whose absence changed the shape of the community in ways that everyone felt. And they were also a logistical reality in a space that was already operating at the edge of its capacity in conditions that required the living to keep functioning regardless of what the living were feeling. The death of children underground, which happened because children are more vulnerable to the illnesses that spread in enclosed spaces, to the nutritional deficits of a siege diet, to the stress responses of developing bodies under sustained threat, would have been among the most acute experiences of underground life. The grief of parents in a carved stone chamber, with nowhere to go and nothing to do, and the awareness that the threat above was still present, and the community's survival still required their participation, is not something the archaeology can measure, but it is something the archaeology implies, in the same way that any human space implies the full range of human experience that occurred within it. Derinkuyu was not only a place of survival and ingenuity and community resilience, it was also a place where people lost things they loved and had to keep going anyway. That is perhaps the most human thing about it, and it is the thing that the engineering and the rolling stone doors and the ventilation shafts do not capture, but that belongs to the story just as much as any of the rest of it. Close your eyes for a moment. Well, not if you're driving, and not if you're at a point in the falling asleep process where closing your eyes means you'll miss the rest of the story, and try to imagine the sound of Derinkuyu at full capacity. 20,000 people, their animals, the movement of air through ventilation shafts, the drip of water, the creak and grind of stone against stone, the overlay of language, conversations, arguments, prayers, children being told to stop doing whatever they were doing, the particular acoustic quality of human community in a confined stone space. The tunnels of Derinkuyu were carved from tuff, which is not a perfectly smooth or acoustically neutral material. Sound would have travelled in unexpected ways, a conversation in one chamber audible as a murmur in another, the sound of livestock on a lower level rising through the ventilation network, the particular resonance of a vaulted stone ceiling catching voices and returning them altered. Stone is an extraordinarily honest acoustic environment. It does not absorb sound the way soft furnishings do, the way carpets and curtains and the general cushioned upholstery of modern life silently absorb the noise we generate without us noticing their contribution. Stone reflects. Stone amplifies. Stone carries sound through its structure in ways that are difficult to predict and impossible to control. In the underground churches of Derinkuyu, this quality was almost certainly experienced as a feature. The barrel-vaulted ceilings would have created the kind of resonant acoustic environment that enhances choral singing and spoken liturgy, making the collective voice of a congregation sound larger and more powerful than the individual voices that composed it. In the residential tunnels and chambers, the same acoustic honesty meant that privacy was a negotiated concept rather than a guaranteed one. You could hear your neighbours could hear you. Everyone was managing this reality simultaneously, which required a level of social tolerance and acoustic diplomacy that modern apartment dwellers, who at least have the option of headphones, might find instructive. The sound of the animals added a particular layer to the acoustic environment that no amount of spatial planning could entirely mitigate. Livestock are not quiet. They are not discreet. They have opinions, and their opinions are expressed at volumes and frequencies that carry through stone with impressive efficiency. The donkeys of Derinkuyu, and there were donkeys because there are always donkeys. The donkey is the eternal companion of agricultural human misery and occasional practical salvation, would have contributed a soundscape to the lower stables that travelled upward through the ventilation system and arrived in the living quarters above as something between a complaint and a weather report. You learned to sleep through it. You had to. There was no alternative. The sounds of ordinary life underground, grinding grain, children playing, the crackle of kitchen fires, the murmur of conversation and prayer would have created over time a specific acoustic texture that the inhabitants of Derinkuyu would have recognised as home. Sound is deeply tied to place in human memory and human emotion. The particular way a space sounds, the specific reverb of a stone ceiling, the frequency at which water drips in a specific chamber, the directional quality of air moving through a specific ventilation shaft, becomes part of the sensory definition of a place, as distinctive and as evocative as its smell or its visual character. The people of Derinkuyu knew the sound of their underground city the way you know the sound of your own home at night. The specific creaks and silences and ambient textures that tell you, without conscious thought, that you are where you belong. Even in the dark, even in the rock, even 50 metres below the surface of a plateau that was, somewhere above them, doing whatever it was going to do next. Derinkuyu was not a permanent home in the sense that no one ever went outside. The historical consensus, supported by the archaeology and by comparative analysis of how similar underground complexes were used in the region, is that the underground cities of Cappadocia functioned as seasonal or emergency refuges rather than as full-time habitations. People lived on the surface during periods of relative security, farming their land, tending their animals, conducting their trade, maintaining the surface towns and churches and community structures that formed the fabric of ordinary life. When threats materialized, when the scouts reported an army approaching, when the raids began, when the political situation deteriorated past the point where surface living felt reasonable, the community descended, and then, when the threat passed, they came back up. This pattern of descent and ascent, repeated across generations, created a particular relationship with the underground space that was neither fearful nor casual but something more practical and intimate, the way a community relates to any place that has saved its life multiple times. The moment of emergence, the rolling back of the stone doors, the first careful assessment of the surface, the gradual return to the light, must have had a quality that purely surface-dwelling experience does not produce. Imagine stepping out of Derinkuyu after months underground. The light is the first thing, not the gentle transition from dim to brighter that modern experience offers in the form of gradually increasing lamp wattage. but the full, unmediated impact of Anatolian sunlight on eyes that have been living by oil lamp for an extended period. It would have been physically overwhelming, painfully bright, beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they have been absent long enough to be genuinely missed rather than merely appreciated. The sky, the horizon, the distance, the wind, the smell of open ground, and the particular quality of outdoor air that is completely different from ventilated underground air in ways that are difficult to articulate but immediately obvious to the body. The return to the surface was also a return to vulnerability. Underground, the community was sealed, defended, managing a known environment with established strategies. On the surface, they were exposed again to weather, to the possibility of another raid, to the ordinary risks of agricultural life in a contested region. The transition required a recalibration, a putting away of the underground posture and the resumption of the surface one. This recalibration was probably not instantaneous or easy, particularly after extended periods below. The body takes time to readjust to natural light cycles. The mind takes time to release the particular vigilance that underground siege conditions require. Children who had been born or had spent significant time underground would have experienced the surface world as genuinely new, overwhelming, spacious, and full of sensory information that the underground had not prepared them for. The surface life between descents was not marked by the dramatic quality that the underground periods possessed in retrospect. It was ordinary. Planting and harvest. The maintenance of buildings and tools. The social events of community life. Marriages, births, deaths, festivals. The ordinary accumulation of shared experience that constitutes a community's identity. The underground city waited below, maintained and stocked and ready, a permanent feature of the landscape that everyone knew and no one thought about constantly. The way you do not think constantly about the smoke detector on your ceiling until the moment it becomes the most important object in the room. Derinkuyu was the smoke detector of an entire civilization, maintained with care, hoped never to be needed repeatedly with great regularity across many centuries by people who were very glad indeed that someone had thought to put it there. The story of how Derinkuyu was rediscovered by the modern world has a quality of almost perfect narrative appropriateness, in that it involves neither a dramatic archaeological expedition nor a carefully planned excavation, but a man in 1963 who noticed that his chickens had gone missing and followed them. The story, as it is generally told, holds that a resident of the town of Derinkuyu was renovating his home and broke through a wall into a tunnel, which led to a room, which led to another room, and so on, the tunnels opening up before him like a sentence that keeps adding clauses, deeper and stranger and more elaborate than the last. The chickens apparently had found their way into the complex through an existing opening and had set up a situation that required their owner to follow them into what turned out to be one of the largest and most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. This is, historically speaking, a completely normal way for important archaeological discoveries to happen, which says something either reassuring or slightly alarming about the state of things lying beneath our feet at any given moment. The history of archaeological discovery is populated with accidental finds of enormous significance. A farmer ploughing a field and hitting something hard, a construction worker whose shovel strikes something that is clearly not rock, a child playing in a cave who notices that the cave goes considerably further back than expected. The underground cities of Cappadocia fall firmly into this tradition. They were not lost in the sense that no one knew they existed. The local population had always known about at least some of the tunnels. They appear in local folklore and in historical accounts going back centuries, and some sections had been used for storage within living memory of their rediscovery. But the full scale of the complex, its depth, its extent, the organised sophistication of its design, this was unknown until the chickens of 1963 provided their accidental contribution to the historical record. The Turkish Department of Culture began systematic excavation and documentation of Derinkuyu shortly after its rediscovery, and the work of mapping and understanding the complex has continued in the decades since, with results that continue to surprise the researchers involved. Each new section opened has revealed details that complicate and enrich the picture of what life underground looked like and how the city was organised. Storage rooms whose contents, though long decayed, left traces that allowed analysis of what was kept there. Ventilation shafts whose engineering revealed new sophistication in the original design. Carved details in the churches and schools that provided evidence of the religious and cultural life of the communities who used them. The city that was rediscovered in 1963 is considerably better understood today than it was then, and considerably less well understood today than it will be in another generation of research. The chickens, for their part, did not receive formal archaeological credit for their contribution, which is consistent with the general treatment of chickens throughout history. Useful, productive, present at nearly every significant moment of human civilization, and almost entirely absent from the official record. But somewhere in the logic of the story there is something genuinely pleasing about the fact that Derinkuyu, a city built to protect the lives of communities under threat carved by human hands with enormous effort and sustained over centuries with care, was brought back to the world's attention not by a team of scholars with funding and equipment and institutional support, but by a man following his chickens through a hole in a wall in 1963. The ancient and the ordinary meeting exactly where they always do, in the middle of someone's unplanned afternoon. Today, if you want to visit Derinkuyu, and after everything we have discussed tonight, you probably do, in the abstract way that historical fascination creates travel intentions that may or may not survive contact with airline ticket prices, you can. The complex is open to tourists, and roughly 10% of its total extent is accessible through guided pathways that take visitors down through the first 8 or so levels, past the carved stables and the storage rooms and the missionary schools and the churches, past the ventilation shafts and the wells, to a depth where the air is cool and still, and the ceiling presses just slightly closer than is comfortable, and the full weight of what was built here begins to make itself felt in the body as well as the mind. Visitors who go down often report the same sensation, a shift in the quality of attention, a quieting of the ordinary mental noise, something that might be described as the archaeological version of a held breath. The tunnels are lit now, of course. Electric lighting has replaced the oil lamps, and the quality of the light is completely different from anything the original inhabitants would have experienced, brighter and more even, and lacking the warmth and movement of flame. In some ways, this makes the space easier to understand structurally, easier to navigate and document and photograph. In other ways, it flattens something that the original darkness would have preserved. A tunnel lit by electric light is a historical exhibit, the same tunnel lit by a single oil lamp held at arm's length, with the darkness beginning where the light ends and the stone ceiling close overhead, is something else, something more immediate, more personal, more honest about the actual conditions of the life that was lived here. Modern visitors get the structure, they do not quite get the experience, and that gap is probably for the best, but it is worth acknowledging. What visitors do get, and what no amount of modern lighting can diminish, is the scale. The scale of Derinkuyu is not something that translates fully into photographs or descriptions, including this one. It has to be experienced spatially, the way the tunnels keep going, the way each level reveals another level below it, the way the complex keeps presenting new rooms and new functions and new evidence of sustained, organised, thoughtful human life in a place that most modern instincts say should not be able to support it. Tourists who enter expecting a cave and find a city undergo a genuine recalibration of their sense of what ancient people were capable of, which is, arguably, the most valuable thing any historical site can offer. The town of Derinkuyu, above the complex, is a small, ordinary Cappadocian town, unremarkable from the outside in the way that many places are unremarkable from the outside. A collection of buildings and streets and the ordinary infrastructure of contemporary provincial life. Beneath it, 80 metres down, is the city that kept its predecessors alive across centuries of threat. The two exist simultaneously, layered on top of each other in the same geographical space, connected by the tunnels that the chickens of 1963 inadvertently reopened to the world. Standing in the town on the surface, knowing what is beneath you, produces a particular quality of historical vertigo, the awareness that the ground under your feet is not simply ground, that the ordinary surface of things conceals depths that are neither metaphorical nor simple, and that the people who lived here before you solved problems we have largely forgotten how to imagine with tools we would consider inadequate, in conditions we would consider impossible, and they did it well enough that the evidence of their success is still there, waiting in the rock for anyone willing to follow it down, which is, when you think about it, a reasonable description of what history always is, the accumulated evidence of people solving problems we have not had to face yet, preserved in the dark, available to anyone willing to go looking. Cappadocia did not exist in isolation from the great political structures of its era, and no political structure shaped the underground cities more profoundly or more durably than the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire that survived the fall of its Western counterpart and continued for nearly 1,000 years from its magnificent capital of Constantinople, claimed Cappadocia as part of its territory from the 4th century of the Common Era onward, and the relationship between the empire and the plateau was one of the more complicated and consequential in the region's long history. The empire provided nominal protection, it provided religious infrastructure, it provided the cultural and theological framework within which the Christian communities of Cappadocia understood themselves and organised their lives. What it could not always provide, despite its considerable resources and its genuine ambition, was actual physical safety at the local level when the Arab raids began in earnest in the 7th century. The Byzantine military system was organised around large mobile field armies and fortified frontier zones, a strategy that worked well at the scale of empire, but left individual communities in the interior in a difficult position when raiding forces moved faster than the imperial response. The Tagmata, the professional central army that the Byzantines relied upon for major campaigns, could win battles and defend Constantinople, but it could not be everywhere on the Anatolian plateau simultaneously, and the raiders who swept through Cappadocia were not always interested in the kind of pitched battle that the Tagmata was designed to fight. They were interested in moving fast, taking what was valuable, and leaving before a serious military response could be organised. Against this kind of threat, the Byzantine army was often several days too late and several kilometres too far away. What Byzantium did provide to Cappadocia that proved enormously consequential was the theological and intellectual tradition that shaped how the underground communities understood their own situation. Cappadocia was not a religious backwater. It was, in the 4th century, one of the most intellectually significant regions in the entire Christian world, the home of the Cappadocian Fathers, a group of theologians including Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, whose contributions to Christian doctrine were foundational and whose influence extended across the entire Byzantine world and beyond. These were men who thought seriously about suffering and resilience, and the relationship between earthly difficulty and spiritual meaning. The communities who descended into the rock centuries after their time were inheritors of a theological tradition that had been developed, in part, by their own predecessors on the same plateau. They were not going underground without resources. They were going underground with a fully developed framework for understanding why endurance mattered and what it was for. The Byzantine period also saw the most intensive development of the religious spaces within Derinkuyu, the churches, the chapels, the missionary schools. Imperial patronage of religious architecture above ground filtered down, in modified form, to the underground equivalents. The architectural decisions made in the underground churches reflect awareness of Byzantine ecclesiastical design, the cruciform plan, the barrel vault, the orientation of the altar that implies not just local tradition, but connection to a broader imperial religious culture. The people who carved those spaces were not improvising. They were reproducing in volcanic tuff the forms of a tradition that connected them to Constantinople, to the wider empire, to a community of faith that extended far beyond the plateau. Even underground, they were Byzantine, see. Even in the rock, they belonged to something larger than themselves. That belonging was not incidental to survival. It was part of what made survival feel worth the considerable effort it required. Not everyone who went underground in Cappadocia was running from something. This is perhaps the most surprising and counterintuitive fact in the entire history of the region, that among the people who descended into the rock, or who carved new spaces in the volcanic landscape, were individuals who chose to do so not out of fear but out of devotion. Cappadocia became, from the early Christian period onward, one of the most significant centres of Christian monasticism in the entire ancient world, and the monastic tradition here had a deeply underground and cave-dwelling character that was not incidental but theologically intentional. The hermits and monks who carved cells into the fairy chimneys, who established monastic communities in the rock faces of the valleys, who retreated into the earth for prayer and contemplation. These people were not seeking safety. They were seeking God, and they had decided, for reasons that made complete sense within their theological framework, that the best place to find him was underground, in silence and darkness, and the specific absence of everything that the surface world offered. The monastic tradition in Cappadocia drew on a broader Eastern Christian understanding of the desert as a spiritually significant space, a place stripped of distraction, of comfort, of the ordinary social textures that kept the mind occupied with things other than the divine. The Egyptian desert fathers, whose writings circulated throughout the Christian world from the 4th century onward, had established the template: withdraw from society, embrace physical deprivation, practice continuous prayer, and in the silence of an empty landscape encounter something that the noise of ordinary life prevented. Cappadocia translated this tradition into its own geological idiom. The deserts became the rock. The empty landscape became the carved cell. The silence of the Egyptian wilderness became the silence of Tuf, which is, if anything, more complete. The cells carved by individual hermits in the Cappadocian valleys are modest, almost to the point of severity. Small, low-ceilinged spaces just large enough for a person to sleep and sit and kneel, with a carved niche for a lamp and sometimes a simple cross scratched into the wall. These are not comfortable spaces even by ancient standards. They are the material expression of a deliberate choice to live with as little as possible, to reduce the physical environment to its minimum, to create conditions in which there was nothing to do but pray, and nothing to look at but stone. The people who inhabited these spaces were not prisoners. They had chosen this. Some of them had left positions of considerable comfort and social standing to do it. The rock, for them, was not a refuge from threat, but a refuge from distraction, which is a different kind of threat, but a threat nonetheless, to the inner life they were trying to cultivate. The larger monastic communities that developed in Cappadocia, some of them substantial settlements of monks living communally in carved cliff-face complexes, brought the organisational logic of underground living to bear on a purely voluntary situation, and the result was communities that in some ways resembled the emergency underground cities in their structure, while differing completely in their purpose and atmosphere. Same stone, same oil lamps, same carved chambers and ventilation considerations, entirely different reason for being there. The emergency city and the monastery are, in a sense, the two poles of the Cappadocian underground experience, one driven by the worst of what human beings do to each other, one driven by the best of what human beings aspire to in themselves. The rock held both equally, without preference. Cappadocia has a memory problem, in the sense that it remembers everything. The plateau is one of those places where the layers of history pile up so densely that any attempt to understand the present without understanding the past becomes quickly absurd, where the name of the region itself is ancient Persian, where the roads follow routes established by armies that have been dust for 2,000 years, where the rock faces bear inscriptions in alphabets that require dedicated scholarly effort to decode. The underground cities are the most dramatic expression of this layered memory, but they are not the only one. The surface of Cappadocia is equally dense with the evidence of the civilizations that passed through it, claimed it, shaped it, and eventually moved on while the plateau remained. To understand Derinkuyu fully, you have to understand the very long and very crowded history of the ground above it, the Persian period, the centuries when Cappadocia was a satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire, governed by Persian administrators and integrated into one of the largest political structures the ancient world had yet produced, left its mark on the region in ways that went beyond the administrative. The Persians were not casual conquerors. They were systematic builders of empire who understood the importance of infrastructure, communication, and the management of subject populations. The Royal Road, the great Persian highway that connected the imperial capital of Susa to the western coast of Anatolia, passed through the region and brought with it the commercial and cultural traffic of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. Cappadocia was not a remote backwater in the Persian imperial system. It was a node in a network, a waypoint on a road that connected the known world. When Alexander the Great swept through in the 4th century before the Common Era, he did what Alexander did everywhere. He arrived very fast, he won, and then he moved on to the next place, leaving behind a Greek-speaking administrative class and a cultural overlay that would persist for centuries. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's death saw Cappadocia governed by a succession of Greek-influenced kingdoms, and the region absorbed Greek language, Greek cultural forms, and Greek artistic sensibilities while retaining its own distinct character. The underground spaces of this period, whatever form they took, whatever communities used them, existed in a landscape that was simultaneously Persian in its deep history, Greek in its current cultural idiom, and Anatolian in its bones. What this long Persian and Greek history contributed to the communities who eventually descended into Derinkuyu was, among other things, experience of empire, of being governed by distant powers with their own priorities, experience of the gap between official protection and actual safety at the local level, experience of the specific vulnerability of a plateau at a crossroads where the traffic of history passed through without asking permission and without being particularly interested in the welfare of the people it passed over. The communities who carved and maintained Derinkuyu across the Christian period were inheritors of a very long tradition of Cappadocian pragmatism, a tradition that had been shaped by centuries of being at the intersection of competing powers and had produced, as its characteristic response, the deep, patient, competent management of circumstances that could not be controlled but could be survived. The underground city is the physical expression of that tradition, but the tradition itself is older than the city by a very considerable margin. There is a reason that Derinkuyu captures the imagination of people who encounter it, and the reason is not purely historical. It is not simply that the engineering is impressive, though it is. It is not simply that the scale is extraordinary, though it is that too. It is that the decision encoded in every carved tunnel, and every rolling stone door and every ventilated chamber is recognizable across every cultural and temporal distance that separates the people who built it from the people who read about it now. The decision is this: we're going to survive this, and we're going to do it together, and we're going to build something that makes survival possible, even when everything above us is wrong. That decision is not ancient. It is not specific to Cappadocia or to the cultures that used the underground cities. It is the decision that every community under serious threat has made in every era of history, expressed here in the most literal possible form, carved into rock, descending 80 meters, sealed with a wheel of stone. Modern emergency preparedness culture, the bunkers, the survival communities, the elaborate off-grid preparations that occupy a particular corner of contemporary anxiety is, in a certain sense, Derinkuyu with better equipment and worse architectural ambition. The impulse is identical. The threat calculus is similar, even if the specific threats have changed. The desire to create a space that is defensible, self-sufficient, supplied for an uncertain duration, protected from the vulnerabilities of the surface world. This is not a modern neurosis. It is an ancient and entirely rational response to the specific condition of living in a world where external forces can and do disrupt ordinary life with little warning. The people of Derinkuyu were not paranoid. They were experienced. There is a meaningful difference, and the distinction is written in the architecture. What Derinkuyu also tells us about ourselves is something about the relationship between fear and creativity. The underground city is a product of threat. Yes, it would not exist without the specific dangers of the Cappadocian geopolitical situation, without the Arab raids and the Persian campaigns and the Mongol sweeps and all the other historical forces that made surface life intermittently impossible. But it is not only a product of fear, it is a product of what human communities do with fear when they have the resources and the collective will to do something constructive with it. Fear, in this case, produced ventilation engineering. Fear produced the rolling stone door. Fear produced underground churches and missionary schools and organised food storage and distributed wells. Fear, in the hands of 20,000 people who decided to manage it rather than be managed by it, produced one of the most impressive examples of community architecture in the ancient world. This is not a comfortable lesson exactly. It does not resolve into a simple inspirational message, but it is an honest one. The best things that human communities have built have often been built under pressure. The necessity that drives ingenuity is frequently the necessity of survival, the pressure of circumstance, the specific productive discomfort of having a serious problem that requires a serious solution. Derinkuyu is serious. The problem it addressed was serious. The solution was extraordinary. And the people who built it were not exceptional in any individual sense. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances who did what ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances consistently do when they are organised and determined and have access to good volcanic tuff. They built something that lasted, which is ultimately all any of us can reasonably hope for. Derinkuyu is the most famous of the Cappadocian underground cities, but it would be a disservice to the wider landscape to leave the story there, because the underground of Cappadocia is not a single remarkable site surrounded by ordinary ground. It is a region saturated with carved spaces, an entire subterranean geography that extended across the plateau in a network of complexes, large and small, simple and elaborate, connected and isolated, each one a specific response to specific local conditions, and each one part of a broader pattern of underground habitation that is, taken together, one of the most extraordinary examples of landscape-scale human engineering anywhere in the ancient world. The estimated figure of between 200 and 600 underground complexes in Cappadocia is not a number that invites casual reading. It is a number that requires a moment of quiet recalibration. Cappadocia, Derinkuyu's neighbour to the north, and its partner at the other end of the 9-kilometre connecting tunnel, is in some respects the more horizontally expansive of the two cities, its accessible levels spread across a wider area at the upper depths, with stables and storage rooms and living quarters arranged in a sprawling lateral plan rather than the more vertically dramatic descent of Derinkuyu. Cappadocia was discovered in 1964, a year after Derinkuyu, and has been partially open to tourists since the 1970s, offering a different spatial experience that complements rather than duplicates the better-known city to the south. Where Derinkuyu goes deep, Cappadocia spreads wide, and the comparison between the two reveals something about the range of approaches that different communities brought to the same fundamental problem of underground survival. Oskonak, to the north of Cappadocia, is smaller but notable for a specific defensive feature that Derinkuyu does not share: holes bored through the rolling stone doors through which defenders could pour hot water or oil onto attackers attempting to breach the entrance. This detail, the recognition that a rolling stone door, impressive as it was, might not be the final word in defensive design, and the consequent addition of an active countermeasure, tells you something important about the iterative nature of defensive engineering. Each generation of underground builders looked at what existed and asked what could be improved. Oskonak's builders looked at the rolling stone door and thought, what if someone brings a lever? And then they added the holes, which addressed the lever problem in a way that was both practical and, from the perspective of the person on the outside, deeply discouraging. The landscape of Cappadocia is, in this sense, a distributed archive of threat response. Hundreds of communities across centuries, each solving variations of the same problem with the materials available to them and the knowledge they had accumulated. Some complexes are barely more than a few carved rooms, the product of a small community with limited resources and a specific local threat. Others rival Derinkuyu in their scale and sophistication, evidence of larger communities with longer histories of underground habitation and the accumulated engineering knowledge that history produces. Taken together, they are not just impressive, they are the record of an entire civilization's sustained, multi-generational, landscape-wide response to the specific experience of living at a crossroads where history passed through without asking permission. The rock remembers all of it. Every chisel stroke, every rolling stone, every ventilation shaft pointed toward a surface that was sometimes safe and sometimes not. It is all still there, waiting in the dark, patient as only stone can be. There is a psychological phenomenon that historians and anthropologists have observed in communities that live under sustained, recurring threat, and it does not look the way most people expect it to look. It does not look like constant panic. It does not look like paralysis or despair or the kind of visible, dramatic suffering that gets depicted in paintings and dramatic recreations. It looks, from the outside, like extraordinary competence. Communities that have been threatened repeatedly and have survived repeatedly develop a particular quality of collective intelligence, a distributed, practiced, almost automatic capacity for threat response that operates below the level of conscious deliberation and produces, as its visible output, things like Derinkuyu. The psychological term for this, in its modern clinical formulation, is something like post-traumatic growth. The counterintuitive finding that exposure to serious threat under the right conditions and with the right social support can produce not just damage but capability. The right conditions, in this case, were the specific ones that Cappadocia provided. A community that stayed together through repeated threats, that survived each one, that had time between threats to process and prepare and improve, and that had a shared framework, religious, cultural, familial, for understanding what the threat meant and why surviving it mattered. Under those conditions, the threat did not only damage the community, it also organised it. It gave it a shared project. It created the specific kind of collective focus that produces extraordinary results. Think about what the repeated experience of descent and survival did to the community's relationship with decision-making. The first time a community goes underground, the descent is probably chaotic. People moving at different speeds, uncertainty about what to bring, disagreements about timing, the specific organisational mess of a large group doing something difficult for the first time under pressure. The 10th time, it is a drill. The 20th time, it is a reflex. Everyone knows their role. The livestock go first, down the wide tunnels into the carved stables. The grain stores are confirmed. The ventilation shafts are checked. The rolling stone doors are tested. The community moves with the kind of coordinated efficiency that only comes from having done something many times under conditions where doing it badly had serious consequences. Derinkuyu did not produce this efficiency. The efficiency produced Derinkuyu, built it, maintained it, improved it with each successive use until it was the extraordinary thing it became. The siege mentality also shaped the community's relationship with trust. Underground, in an enclosed space, with limited resources and an unknown duration, the ordinary social tensions of community life were both more dangerous and more visible than they were on the surface. A conflict that could be managed by distance above ground, neighbours who avoided each other, families who conducted their disagreements within the privacy of their own homes, became impossible to manage by distance below ground, where everyone was present and the corridors were narrow and the oil lamps illuminated everything. Communities that survived extended underground habitation were communities that had developed, either before the descent or painfully during it, a functional level of social cohesion, the ability to manage conflict without allowing it to compromise the collective survival project. This is not a romantic picture of our ancient communal harmony. It is a practical one. The people of Derinkuyu were not unusually virtuous or unusually patient or unusually immune to the ordinary human impulse to find other people irritating under conditions of prolonged proximity. They were people who had learned from experience that the irritating neighbour was also the person who knew how to maintain the ventilation shaft on level 7, and that this made the irritation manageable. Necessity is not just the mother of invention. It is also, under the right conditions, the mother of tolerance. The historical record of Derinkuyu, like the historical record of most ancient communities, is largely silent on the subject of women, which is a silence that tells you something important about who was keeping the record and what they considered worth recording, and nothing useful about what was actually happening in the underground city during the periods of its use. Women were present in Derinkuyu in the same proportions they were present everywhere, which is to say approximately half the population, and the work they performed in the underground city was, by any honest accounting, the work on which the community's daily survival most directly depended. They ground the grain, they managed the food preparation, they cared for the children and the elderly, they maintained this social fabric of the community in the specific ways that social fabrics are maintained, which is through sustained, unglamorous, continuous effort that produces no dramatic moments and leaves no dramatic evidence, but without which nothing else functions. The grain grinding alone deserves a moment of recognition, because it is one of those activities that the historical record mentions casually. Grain was ground into flour. Bread was baked without conveying what it actually entailed as a daily physical reality. Grinding grain by hand using a stone quern is hard work. It is repetitive. It requires sustained physical effort. It produces clouds of grain dust in an enclosed space with limited ventilation, and it needs to happen every day in quantity sufficient to feed thousands of people. In a modern kitchen, this activity takes approximately 30 seconds and involves a machine with an electric motor and a pulse setting. In Derinkuyu, it took hours, performed by women working in pairs or small groups, and it was as essential to the community's survival as the rolling stone doors or the ventilation shafts, and considerably less celebrated. The management of children underground fell primarily to women, and this task under underground siege conditions had a specific character that surface childcare did not share. Children in Derinkuyu needed to be kept quiet, not constantly, not cruelly, but with an awareness that noise travelled through the tunnels in unpredictable ways, and that the community's concealment depended on a level of acoustic discipline that young children are not naturally inclined toward. The management of a frightened or bored or sick child in a carved stone chamber, in low light, with nowhere to take them and nothing to distract them except what could be improvised from the materials available, required a quality of patient creativity that is not documented anywhere in the archaeological record, and was almost certainly performed primarily by women every day for the duration of every period of underground habitation. Women also served as the primary bearers of the community's informal knowledge, the recipes, the remedies, the practices of daily life that were transmitted orally from mother to daughter across generations, and that did not require literacy or formal education to preserve and transmit. This knowledge was not trivial. It included medicinal knowledge, which plants, stored or dried, treated which ailments, food preservation techniques, the management of childbirth and infant care, and the accumulated practical wisdom of generations of women who had managed households under difficult conditions and had passed on what worked. Underground, cut off from the surface world and its resources, this knowledge was not supplementary, it was foundational. The women of Derinkuyu carried it with them into the rock, and they brought it back out when the doors opened. And so here we are, at the bottom of something. Not literally, not tonight. You're horizontal and warm, and the ceiling above you is a perfectly reasonable distance away. But at the bottom of a story about people who went as deep as they needed to go, and came back up again. Every time. Think about what Derinkuyu actually was. Stripped of the engineering and the archaeology and the impressive numbers. It was a community decision, a collective agreement, renewed across generations that said, We're not leaving. We're not abandoning this land, this life, these people. We're going underground for a while, and when it is safe, we're coming back. That decision, quiet, practical, unglamorous, made in the face of armies and raids and the specific exhausting experience of living somewhere that powerful forces kept deciding they wanted, is one of the more remarkable things any group of human beings has ever agreed to. 20,000 people, 80 meters down. Oil lamps and rolling stone doors and ventilation shafts and wells and schools and churches and the sound of donkeys echoing through carved tuff at 2 a.m. They maintained their faith down there. They taught their children down there. They buried their dead and ground their grain and tended their animals and argued about things that seemed important and told stories in the dark. They were, in every way that matters, completely human, under conditions that most of us will never face and cannot fully imagine. And then, when it was over, they came back up, into the light, into the wind, into the enormous Cappadocian sky, blinking and grateful and already, probably, thinking about what needed to be repaired before the next season. You're lying in a bed tonight. A real bed, with a real ceiling at a comfortable height, with natural light available at the touch of a switch, and water available at the turn of a tap and air that moves freely through your room, without anyone having to carve a 50-metre shaft through volcanic rock to provide it. The people of Derinkuyu would have considered your situation almost incomprehensibly comfortable. They would have had questions, probably many questions, because they were clearly people of considerable curiosity and practical intelligence. And then they would have gone to sleep, because sleep is the one thing that every human being across every era of history has understood to be both necessary and, when finally available, deeply welcome. So let the rocks settle around you tonight, in the metaphorical sense. Let the tunnels close. Let the stone doors roll into place. Let the ventilation shafts do their quiet work. You are safe. You are warm. You are, by the standards of most of human history, extraordinarily lucky. The ancient plateau of Cappadocia is still there, still enormous, still watching the sky change over the fairy chimneys at dawn, and 80 metres below it, in the cool and the dark and the absolute silence of volcanic tuff, the rooms are empty and waiting and patient in the way that only stone can be patient. Sleep well.